Good afternoon, everybody. So problem sets we need to have down front if you haven't turned them in yet. So bring one down, hand them to one of the GSIs. They'll either sort them and put them in the appropriate pile or throw them away, depending upon what kind of mood they're in. Okay, so today we want to continue with our discussion of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. Remember that at the end of last week, we brought together our aggregate demand curve, which was derived from the monetary policy curve and the IS curve. Basically shows how much planned expenditures are taking place in the economy for any given level of inflation. We married that with our long-run aggregate supply curve, which was basically similar to the steady state in our solo model, dependent upon the factors of production, total factor productivity, and the efficiency with which the labor market operates. And then we also added in our short-run aggregate supply curve, which was kind of something new. Short-run aggregate supply curve basically is telling us the relationship between expected and actual inflation and how businesses will produce relative to that difference. So we want to take all of that information, as well as the disequilibrium dynamics that we talked about last time, and run it through several scenarios today to talk about what is actually happening in the economy that generates business fluctuations themselves. So there are three kinds of shocks that can occur in an economy. Now, these can occur simultaneously, or they can occur individually, they can occur in isolation, or they can occur sequentially. So depending upon what kind of shock we have will depend upon what kind of economic outcome there is. So we can have shocks to either the aggregate demand curve, the long-run aggregate supply curve, or the short-run aggregate supply curve. And we want to look at each one of those. Now recall, as I've mentioned earlier, that we shouldn't read anything into the word shock. Right? It doesn't have a good meaning, it doesn't have a bad meaning, it's just a word. And shock simply means that we've had some change in an exogenous variable that influences the model. So when we think about aggregate demand shocks, we're talking about what are the various things that could change aggregate demand, causing the curve to shift either to the left or the right. So when the curve shifts, we refer to these shocks as either positive or negative. So recall when we, as I mentioned last time, when we think about the aggregate demand curve, we'll always be thinking about shifts to the left or right, because with aggregate demand, what we really care about is what the level of economic output is, what's happening to planned expenditures. So by definition, a positive shock is any change in an exogenous variable that causes the aggregate demand curve to move to the right. Another way of thinking about that is a positive aggregate demand shock is any kind of shock that will increase the level of economic output. Right? A negative shock, just the opposite. It's a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, so a negative shock will be anything that is going to cause the level of economic output to decline. We're not concerned with the level of economic output, whether we're above, below, or right at general equilibrium, long-run potential output. Rather, we're only concerned about the direction of the movement. Positive shocks are also sometimes referred to by other adjectives indicating something is good, right? Like favorable or beneficial. Negative shocks also use other adjectives that are sometimes used in a detrimental way. Unfavorable, unbeneficial, adverse. So we can use lots of those things to keep in mind. Just remember the positive ones are suggesting something happens to increase economic output by shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right. So here's an example that I'm actually going to compress of three different shocks that happened in the early to mid 2000s. So we had a situation where taxes were reduced, and for now we're going to assume that these are autonomous taxes. We'll see later what effect changing income tax rates has. So autonomous taxes were reduced. The Federal Reserve eased monetary policy. So this is a reduction in the autonomous monetary policy, or R-bar. So at every level of inflation, the central bank is bringing down the real interest rate. And finally, banks loosened credit standards. So we can think about this as a financial friction. So in addition to having a lower real interest rate, the banks were reducing kind of the sand in the gears, if you will, the frictions that were in the labor market, making it easier for people to borrow money. So we might think of it as an example. Suppose before banks did this, it required you to have a credit score of, say, 700 in order to get a loan. And now if they said, well, we don't need 700, we only need 600. So notice that all those people who had credit scores between 6 and 700 would now have a much easier time getting loans. That's an easing of credit standards. We could think of that as a reduction in the financial frictions that are taking place in the marketplace. So all three of these things happened. Now I'm going to aggregate all three of these, but in fact they happened somewhat sequentially. That is, taxes were cut first, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, then eased monetary policy afterwards, and banks eased credit standards a little bit later. So we could think of this as three separate positive aggregate demand shocks. But as I said, I want to aggregate these just so our chart doesn't get too full of curve shifts. So let's assume then that we started at general equilibrium. And then these three events take place, which causes the aggregate demand curve to shift out. So we had a positive aggregate demand shock. Now, think about what happens before inflation changes. Right? Before inflation changes, we can come across at pi naught. We see that aggregate demand is way out here, right? Very far to the right. So we've got a lot of demand in the economy. But producers, businesses, are still sitting back here at point A. This is where they're comfortable producing, where they expect inflation at pi naught, and that's where inflation is. So what they expect, they're seeing from their input costs and their output prices. Everybody's happy with where they are. But if you look at that, one of the things that you can see, we have excess demand in the economy. There's a lot more aggregate demand than there is short-run aggregate supply. Now remember, we started at the natural rate of unemployment, at potential output. So with this excess demand in the economy, businesses will see their inventories dropping in an unplanned way. To deal with that, they'll want to increase production. To increase production, they're going to need to hire more workers. But most of the workers are already employed. So for all businesses to hire more workers, what we would have to see is a higher wage. Businesses will start competing with one another by offering a higher wage to try to find additional workers. As that happens, then, inflation begins to rise. Now, as inflation begins to rise, the central bank will increase the real interest rate along the monetary policy curve. As the real interest rate rises, the cost of borrowing has gone up, borrowing falls, planned expenditures decline, aggregate demand then is reduced along the aggregate demand curve. At the same time, what businesses expect is inflation of pi naught. That's what they expect their input costs to be. But as inflation rises, what they see is that their selling price has gone up. Now, if you think your input costs are fixed and your selling price is going up, it also means that your profit margins have widened out. At a higher profit margin, you're willing to produce more. So businesses will also now, in reaction to this increase in inflation, start to produce more. And this is simply a movement up along the short-run aggregate supply curve. And that happens until we get to point B. Now notice this movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve is based on our original assumption that we have adaptive inflationary expectations. What we expect inflation to be is in the prior year. That's different from what actual inflation is. So in some sense, the way this model works is we're saying that businesses are fooled for 1 year. They can see that their selling price has gone up, but they don't quickly recognize that their input costs are also rising. So now we're at point B, and what do we see? Inflation has risen to pi 1, and economic output has risen to y1. So what has happened to the unemployment rate? It's not a trick question. It's not a hard question either. It's gone down, right? So just think about Okun's law. Whenever the output gap becomes more positive, the negative unemployment gap is going to go down. So unemployment falls while economic output rises. Now, one other thing that we need to show here. We had a shift in our aggregate demand curve, but there was no change in our aggregate supply curve. Our short-run aggregate supply curve is still the same. And that's because in that first year, inflation expectations did not change. So here we are in year 1, higher inflation and higher level of economic output. But then we also can see the point B is a short-term equilibrium, but not a long-run equilibrium. Which brings us back to the initial question. What happens next? What happens next? And here what we can see is that in year 1, we expected inflation of pi naught. But actual inflation was higher at pi 1. So the following year then, our inflation expectations are going to change. They're going to change and they're going to rise to pi 1. So now we're going to start the whole analysis at pi 1. Well, if that's where our expected inflation is, it also means that to be in long-run equilibrium, the short-run aggregate supply curve needs to pass through the long-run aggregate supply curve at that inflation rate of pi 1. So our short-run aggregate supply curve shifts higher because of this change in inflation expectations. But now we need to look at where we are. So inflation's at pi 1, whatever that level might be. If we look at where short-term equilibrium was, we can see that aggregate demand, when inflation is pi 1, is still at point B. But the level at which businesses would be comfortable producing at that inflation rate is given by the intersection of the short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate supply curve. So notice that in this economy, we still have excess demand. That excess demand now means, again, inventories are falling from a business perspective in an unplanned way. Businesses say, gee, I can sell everything and more, so I need to increase production. But again, in order to increase production, I need to hire workers, presumably away from other businesses because a lot of people are employed, and that means that inflation will begin to accelerate. And as that happens, the central bank then raises the real interest rate along the monetary policy curve. That higher real interest rate reduces borrowing and planned expenditures along the IS curve and also along the aggregate demand curve. The higher inflation also makes businesses more willing to produce, and those movements continue until we get back to a short-term equilibrium at point C. Notice then, when year 2 is all done with, we have higher inflation, but economic output is now coming back towards potential. Which means, of course, that we have some sort of adjustment mechanism going on that's ultimately going to bring us back to general equilibrium. But point C is a short-term equilibrium, not a long-run equilibrium. So again, something else needs to happen in the following year. And what happens is, again, another change in expected inflation. In year 2, we expected inflation of pi 1. We ended up with inflation of pi 2, higher. So now expected inflation is going to move up to pi 2. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift up. And that process that we've been through will continue until we get to this point right here, which I'll label N. So the short-run aggregate supply curve continues to shift up in a series of movements, not all at once, until we get to point N, at which time inflation is now even higher. But once we get to point N, we're back in general equilibrium, so now the inflation rate stops changing. It simply stays at pi N. And economic output continues to move back towards potential output. And once we get to that point, we're back in general equilibrium again. So several things to notice about this entire process. A positive aggregate demand shock leads to an immediate increase in economic output and reduction in unemployment and an increase in inflation. As the adjustment process is ongoing, inflation continues to rise, economic output begins to move back towards potential, the output gap disappears, and unemployment will eventually rise back to the natural rate of unemployment. So the unemployment rate at point A, our initial general equilibrium, and at point N, our final general equilibrium, will be exactly the same, the natural rate of unemployment. Now, several things that we can also add to that. How high inflation will rise depends upon the magnitude of the aggregate demand shock. It does not depend upon whether wages and prices are very flexible or very sticky. It only depends upon the size of the aggregate demand shock. The new equilibrium, point N, will always be at the intersection of the relevant aggregate demand curve and the relevant long-run aggregate supply curve. We didn't change our long-run aggregate supply curve. We simply shifted out the aggregate demand curve. A bigger outward shift is going to lead to even higher inflation. The other thing that we can't necessarily see directly from this example, but hopefully you can understand, is if wages and prices are very flexible, the short-run aggregate supply curve would be much steeper than what I've drawn. The time that it would take after the aggregate demand shock to get back to our final general equilibrium, point N, would be relatively short. If wages and prices were very sticky, the short-run aggregate supply curve would be nearly horizontal, and it would take a much longer period of time to get back to general equilibrium. So the magnitude of the increase in inflation depends upon the magnitude of the aggregate demand shock. The speed with which the economy returns to general equilibrium depends upon the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So we've got lots of things that are going on in this particular situation. Now, here's some data that I pulled that will actually show us what was happening during this period of time. So the first thing to notice, the blue line at the top is the unemployment rate. Now, in our diagram, it shows that economic output rose, and then it's coming back towards potential. So what we would have seen is that the unemployment rate would have dropped, but then it should have started to come back up. But remember what I told you at the very beginning of this example. What actually happened was 3 sequential aggregate demand shocks. So the first aggregate demand shock, the reduction in taxes, pushed out economic output and dropped the unemployment rate. The second aggregate demand shock from a lower real interest rate pushed out the aggregate demand curve, increased economic output some more, pushed down the unemployment rate. And then the third aggregate demand shock, banks loosening lending standards happened, pushing out the aggregate demand curve a third time and leading to higher economic output and a lower unemployment rate. Unemployment declined for a number of years. The other thing that we can see is that if we look at inflation, in particular the purple line, we can see that inflation accelerated during this period of time. We saw a low of around 1%, but maybe more accurately 1.5%. We can see kind of at the end we're up to around 3% inflation. Now the difference between the purple line that I've circled and the orange line kind of in the middle, the orange line is the consumer price index for everything. The purple line is the consumer price index for everything except food and energy prices. And the central bankers and macroeconomists often like to look at inflation without food and energy prices because they're very volatile and have a tendency to return to the mean. So over an intermediate to longer term time period, we generally don't see oil prices or food prices causing changes in the trend in inflation. But even with that, you can see that overall inflation went from roughly 2% to nearly 4% during this period of time before there was a sharp drop in energy prices in 1986. So just what we would expect to happen. Big positive aggregate demand shocks. I'm sorry, I said 1986, 2006. Duh. There was a big drop in 1986 too. So what we see is exactly, what the data show us is exactly what we would expect to happen. Unemployment rate comes down, inflation goes up. Now, one thing I forgot to show you on this, because I forgot it on Thursday and then had to go back and do it. So if we look at the pattern of economic output or the output gap and inflation, again, notice what we have is this counter-cyclical movement from basically 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Okay? When we see these kinds of movements between the output gap and inflation, what it's basically telling us, whenever we have a positive output gap, okay, whenever we're to the right of long-run aggregate supply curve, above potential output, we should have rising inflation. The rising inflation will lead to higher real interest rates, which is going to bring the economy back to a zero output gap. Okay. And this is the annual data that for that same time period. As you can see, the unemployment rate comes down and the inflation rate goes up for most of that time period. Okay, blah, blah. Now, let's take a second example. Let's suppose instead we have a negative aggregate demand shock. So this is something that feels like ancient history, I'm sure especially to you. Wish I could say it felt like ancient history to me. But in this situation, we had, in the early 1980s, we had the central bank significantly increasing the real interest rate, the autonomous portion of monetary policy. For every level of inflation, the Federal Reserve increased the real interest rate. Just to give you an idea, the nominal interest rate went from 6 or 7% to 22%. So we're talking about big, big change. I remember this well because in the early 80s I bought a house and my mortgage rate was 16.5%. That hurts a lot. That hurts a lot. It's all right, though, because now my mortgage rate is 1 5/8.